Is the Colts offensive line good enough to enter 2023, or will they make the same critical error that doomed their previous season? Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in and making us your very first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am Jake Arthur. He is Zach Hicks. I'm your boots on the ground, credentialed member of the media for horseshoehuddle.com, bringing you the latest currently from Colts OTAs. Zach is just cranking out the film reviews. He's got yet another series that he's working on, involving Anthony Richardson as a +1 rusher at quarterback. Zach, you want to give a quick little synopsis of what you're working on real quick?
Yeah. So this article series is all about talking about the impact of a mobile quarterback and how it kind of evens the game out to be an 11-on-11 game rather than to be, a 10-on-11 with the quarterback that's just sitting back there and distributing and stuff like that. So we're going to tackle a lot of different topics in this series, from how it impacts the ground game in general, how scrambling and sack negation are huge, and also how it creates explosive plays, just having that type of quarterback there. So yeah, fun series. We're going to have the second installment of it coming out today when you guys are listening to this episode. So yeah, definitely keep an eye out for that.
If you haven't already, I'm going to go ahead and compare Anthony Richardson to Steph Curry, because it's a point guard who's not just a distributor, he's a weapon. So you heard it here first. Anthony Richardson is the new NFL's Stephen Curry.
Well, don't they compare everybody to Stephen Curry? Like, isn't that what Bryce Young was compared to? And they compare like so many other dudes to it. We got to find a new fun, like Allen Iverson. That's a fun one right there. Let's do
that. Iverson. Is a good one. You know what? I'm going to have to ask him next. If you were an NBA player, who would you want to be compared to? It's probably LeBron. But anyways, right. We're getting off on a whole new tangent. Not us, right? But on today's show, we are talking offensive line. It's an interesting group. I think we proceed with caution on this one because it seemed like they finally figured things out about midway last year. We'll go through the offensive tackles, what they look like, the interior of the line, what's the depth like there? Are the starters good enough? Can you still rely on those pillars there inside? And then we'll take a look at a few of the bubble guys who might be able to make the roster. So heading into it, first thing, Zach, the starting five, we'll just name it real quick. Bernhard, Raimann, Quenton Nelson, Ryan Kelly, Will Fries, and Braden Smith. Same starting five that ended last season. For everything he didn't necessarily do right, Jeff Saturday did seem to figure out and get the juice going on the best starting five offensive line. But are you confident with this group heading into this year? Because they're kind of taking the same approach as they did last year. They've kind of identified their starting five. They have kind of seemingly put all their eggs in that basket and not necessarily made significant changes to the group. What do you think?
Yeah, a little concerned for sure, especially at guard. I love Will Fries. You guys know that I'm a huge fan of Will Fries, and I think he got better and better as the season went along, but I would have liked to see just a veteran addition to that, having a more capable backup behind him than some of the guys we're going to talk about, or just having, someone that can come in and make you feel a little bit better about that. Will Fries were to beat out a veteran on the market or something like that, that's fine. I feel good about that if he's able to beat that guy out, but having him compete against an undrafted free agent from Alabama as his biggest competition, that's not the most inspiring thing ever. It's like kind of putting the ball on the tee and saying, okay, as long as you can hit this, you can be the starter, So you wanted to see a little more competition, a little bit more depth, but I understand the direction they're going because this is a work in progress. This is, I don't want to say it's a rebuild, but it's a bit of a retool here in Indy. You want to go young at certain positions. So you don't want to just bring in some 30-something-year-old offensive lineman to take away snaps from Will Fries, to take away snaps from Bernhard Raimann. So it's going to be big to see those two guys get on the field this year and play. It does feel a little different from last year because of that regard. They're not just throwing, Matt Pryor was a veteran that we knew was not going to get a ton better. Obviously he got a lot worse than what we expected, but he was never going to be this like superstar left tackle of the future, where Bernhard Raimann, you feel good, could maybe one day be your left tackle of the future. So it is still kind of leaning on that youth movement, getting those guys out there. But, it is what it is. We would love to have seen more competition, but I don't hate going young, especially when you have a 21-year-old quarterback, when you have a defense in the secondary as young as they are back there as well. Go young and see what hits and what doesn't.
Yeah, so the starting offensive tackles, there is a lot to like there. I mean, last season, according to Pro Football Focus, Braden Smith and Bernhard Raimann, they were numbers 1 and 3 on the Colts offense overall in terms of grade. So according to PFF, Smith and Raimann were the first and third best Colts offensive players all year last year. Raimann, you can see improvement there. In his first 7 games, his average grade was 61.7. In the final 6 games of the season, the average grade was 72.5. So clear improvement there, a pretty significant jump. There were some penalties and, some inopportune moments to allow sacks, things like that. But overall, I think you saw clear growth. And looking at him this offseason, as far as his frame goes, he looks a bit stronger. He's added some weight. He's like 318 right now, I think he said. So, Braden Smith, probably not a lot of right about there. And you really don't want to, because, you don't want there to be some huge issue with that. But what are you thinking with Raimann moving forward?
Yeah, Raimann, it's a huge year for him. Obviously, every year is big in the NFL because your chances are just dwindling with each passing season. But we saw a lot of good things late last season. Him growing from a rookie who definitely should not have been on the field in that Denver Broncos game to, okay, like we got something here. He's not coming out here lighting the world on fire, but he looked like a pretty solid tackle by the end of the year. And if you can build upon that and go from solid tackle to above average starter this year, we're talking a major, major win from where they drafted him. So Bernhard Raimann, I have high expectations for him. And honestly, it's probably the most important player, like not named Anthony Richardson, on this offense, because if you can't figure out that left tackle and you're giving him this whole year to start there, we're in a major, major dilemma going into the next draft cycle of probably taking one with a really high pick, because you're probably going to be picking pretty high if your left tackle just has a horrible season this year. So Bernhard Raimann's a really, really big piece of this offense, and I'm excited to see what he can do, because I was really impressed late last year.
Yeah, I marked him as one of the most important Colts on the whole roster in yesterday's show, basically because you have Anthony Richardson right there. You don't want to screw this up. But looking at some of the depth guys, these are probably the 3 tackles with the highest likelihood of making the roster. Really only one of them has a really high likelihood, and that would be rookie Blake Freeland. He really looks the part. He's a huge player, another super athletic guy. He filled in at right tackle for Smith, with Smith being out during OTAs so far from what we've seen. But then you've also got Carter O'Donnell, who signed a contract extension this offseason, and Jordan Murray, who they seem to like. Oddly enough, O'Donnell and Murray are both Canadian players, which you don't see a whole lot of. But yeah, the Colts seem to like them. Murray's another really big, seemingly athletic guy. So what do you think about this trio, and if any of them might be able to make it?
Yeah, so Blake Freeland's almost certainly locked in as that swing tackle. Obviously, O'Donnell and Murray have a chance to push him, and they could certainly make some waves here this offseason. But we've kind of seen those guys for a couple years now, and while Carter O'Donnell's kind of gotten a little bit better, it's never really been anything, crazy. Like, we're not really looking at either of those 2 guys and saying, like, we have to have them going into next season. But yeah, Blake Freeland, he's a guy who has experience at left tackle, has experience at right tackle. The Colts view him mostly as a right tackle, and there could be some personnel sets where he's, a jumbo set tight end, or he's a guy who comes in for Braden Smith and they move Braden Smith into right guard for a couple personnel sets. So yeah, I think Freeland's going to have a pretty big role this year. I don't really know with those other 2 guys. They might keep another tackle. It might be one of those 2 guys, or it could be a free agent addition, but I only really feel good about Blake Freeland making the roster out of those 3.
Yeah, again, a chunk of the roster you don't feel super great about with the depth, and probably would have liked to have seen them add someone. But next, is the Colts interior truly fixed? But first, we're going to get to a word from FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Everyone, go make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs ahead of this Heat Nuggets finals. Right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500 now. That's a huge increase. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, America's sports betting partner of the NBA.
And everydayers, make sure you're caught up on all the positional breakdown series. We have a playlist for it here on YouTube. And Jake also went over the triple play yesterday, the 3 most important Colts, 3 guys who can make their first Pro Bowl, and 3 vets on the hot seat. So make sure you check that out, all you beautiful everydayers. All right, Jake, so diving into the interior offensive line, I feel like obviously with Will Fries, we already kind of touched on him in the first segment here, but for the other 2 guys, Quenton Nelson, Ryan Kelly, when we're talking about starters, it really just needs to be a bounce back year for both of them. Like, Quenton Nelson still played fairly well last year. I don't want, when we talk negative about his play last season and talk about how it was a bad season for him, it was still like a fringe Pro Bowl season. Like, he was still a good player. It's just, you're paying him to be the best interior offensive lineman in the entire league. And he just was not that at all last year. I mean, even if you look at it in the most positive light ever, he was not that at all. He just was not playing like Quenton Nelson last year, whether it was injuries, whether it was just, the vibe of the season or whatever it was, just not being right for him. He could just never really get it going. And there were moments last year where it's like, that's Quenton Nelson getting tossed around by Dexter Lawrence like he's nothing, getting tossed around by Taylor Tart against the Titans. Like, I'm not saying it's wrong to get beat every now and then, but he was getting manhandled in some of these matchups. So we need to see the return of Quenton Nelson back to his dominance. And then Ryan Kelly as well, a fringe Pro Bowl guy for most of his career, just did not play like a starting center at all for most of the last season, like a below average center. He needs to get back to at least average level for this offensive line to work out. So I think the biggest thing for me when I look at this interior, besides just Will Fries and his adjustment period and becoming a full-time starter, is will Quenton Nelson and Ryan Kelly actually bounce back with a new offensive line coach and a new offense in general?
Yeah, and I think Raimann and Fries still being there plays a big part in it too, because the Colts did have the same starting 5 all throughout last offseason. It didn't work. So, Kelly and Nelson probably had to overcompensate and try and take on a little too much. But now the starting 5 they're a part of, they've already got half a season playing together. Mm-hmm. So they already know a lot of Raimann's tendencies and Will Fries' tendencies, and they may not have to do so much babysitting if that's what they were doing. One thing about them is part of their improvement might be something we're just not going to be able to see behind the scenes. New offensive line coach Tony Sperano Jr. said, this group just needs to get the trust back, and they need to do team building and kumbaya type of stuff, and just getting back to trusting each other. And again, that's just not something we're going to see until it's week 1 and you get your first big test of the season. We won't know until then, unfortunately, because again, training camp, it's hard to judge that as well, because even on days you have pads, it's just hard, schematically. There's just so much that goes into offensive line play. So all you can really do on it at this point is say these guys are veterans and they know what to do. The past couple seasons has not really been it. But, what can you do? And then looking at Will Fries at right guard, I had mentioned, Raimann had a nice ascension throughout last season. The same can be said with Fries, not to the same level, but I was looking at his grades as well. Through his first half of the season, his average game was a grade of 55.4. Back half of the season was 65.1. So a jump of 10 points on average. So you can see that Raimann and Fries, the young guys of the group, the guys that the veterans had to carry, they have gotten better. So across the board, maybe it's not going to be this 2018, 2019, 2020 offensive line that was killing everybody, but can it be at least average? Can it create holes for Jonathan Taylor, and can it keep its quarterback alive? That's all you really need.
Yeah, and can they pick up stunts? That's the biggest thing.
Oh God, yeah. If you were a defender and you were the extra pressure at all, congratulations on your pressure or sack, because you were getting it.
Yeah, the communication was bad, and I completely agree with what Tony Sperano Jr. had to say about that. Just getting the trust back to each other, because outside of maybe Ryan Kelly, which we could talk about with that as well, I don't think that like the strength or athleticism has really deteriorated with any of these guys. They're all superb athletes. They're all really technically sound players. They're good players on this interior offensive line and on this offensive line in general. It's just nothing clicked whatsoever. And they were stepping on each other's toes. They were not picking up the right stunts. They were missing blitz reads. Like it was just a really just non-cohesive mess in every single regard when it came to this offensive line. And honestly, again, Ryan Kelly's probably the only one who looks like physically he's dropped off a little bit. So it is a really interesting thing. It's all about just getting back to where they were. And especially with Quenton Nelson, Braden Smith, and again, Ryan Kelly as well, if he can get back to it. Like these guys just need to get back to what they are, and they need to be worth their contracts, because even if Nelson and Smith did not play terribly last year, they were not playing up to their contract. They were not playing what they were getting paid to be played as. Braden Smith is getting paid as a top 6 tackle in the NFL right now. He was certainly not a top 6 tackle in the NFL last year. Again, Quenton Nelson's getting paid to be the best interior offensive lineman in the league. He was not playing that way last year. So these guys just need to get their trust back. They need to get their ability back, and they need to play like what they're getting paid as.
Totally agree. And so one big reason that they really need to step up and, stay healthy, which is something they can't really control, but the depth is a little iffy there. Now you do have some guys who could play inside and out, sure. But right now your depth on the interior, your main depth is Danny Pinter, Dakota Shepley, and Wesley French. Now Pinter, for everything he did wrong at right guard as the starter last year, every other time we've seen him filling in at center for Ryan Kelly has been pretty good. That's an area I feel comfortable with Danny Pinter being as a depth piece filling in at center. I like that. That's fine. Shepley and French are a couple really relative unknowns. French is kind of a mauler. Shepley, I don't know a lot about him yet because he's a newcomer, but the Cowboys did not love that they lost him to the Colts, and he only played a handful of snaps last season. But he's another guy that seems to be a developmental player. Came out in 2018, so he's been around for a little bit. There's only one guy we know about, and he has one specific role that he's pretty good at.
Yeah, I would say as of right now, the backup at guard is Braden Smith. I think if a guard were to go down right now in camp, Braden Smith would swing over to right guard or left guard, and then you would have Blake Freeland come in at right tackle. I think that's why they're having Freeland kind of focus on the right tackle aspect, which, in some regards, get your best 5 on the field, but also like, if your guard depth is so bad that you need to move your right tackle over to play guard if someone goes down, like get another guard in there. Like what are you wasting time on Shepley and French and all them for? Like I'm not saying these are terrible players and they are certainly going to be competing for the bottom of the roster, but I would like to see a move at guard just to have someone there, so we don't have to move Braden Smith around. And again, Blake Freeland could be a good player at right tackle, but it's definitely a downgrade going from, again, Braden Smith, for everything that happened last year, was a league average right tackle. Like that's hard to come by. If Blake Freeland becomes a league average right tackle at any point in his career, it's a win of a career for him. So to move that off of there to a guard and then bring in this 4th round, 5th round rookie, I think it was 4th round rookie, to play at right tackle, like that's a major risk. I would rather have throwing in, like a 30-year-old guard that may not be great, but having like a below average guard and still having your league average tackle. I think that's a better combination. So I think they need to figure that out for sure. Because Dakota Shepley, Wesley French, and especially if Danny Pinter were to play guard, I have no confidence in that at all. There's no competition with those guys. Like that's a sad group right there behind the 2 guards.
Yeah, and there are still some veteran options floating around out there that don't have to be like your no doubt starting right guard. You got I haven't checked to see if these guys have been signed within the last few days, but Gabe Jackson, Trey Turner, guys that have done it before, but aren't necessarily going to move the needle and threaten, if you've got a young guy that you like. But anyways, next up, which of the bubble guys might grab one of these final spots on the roster? Up next. All right, Zach. So there's really a couple interesting names here at the bottom of the offensive line depth chart. Just starting with the offensive tackles, you've got Jake Witt, 7th round pick, who's got a really interesting athletic journey, basketball player. He was a tight end as well. I think he also missed a COVID season, The dude is used to change. Like, he could really use some stability. Like, I'm already looking forward to year number 2 for him to see what he could grow into. And then you've got Matthew Vanderslice. So any thoughts on the bottom of the offensive tackle depth? And can any of the guys, probably more likely Witt, make it?
I think Jake Witt has a chance just in case, if he has a solid offseason and other teams around the league are like, hey, we have an extra roster spot, then the Colts just waive Jake Witt. We want to keep that we want to get that on our roster because look at the athletic profile, look at the length, look at the size, look what he can be, and he can be one of our inactives every week. So I think if it comes down to that, where he shows something in camp and shows something in the offseason, the Colts might just have to keep him on that 53-man roster as an inactive player to shield him from other teams. So I think Jake Witt has a decent chance, even if he doesn't play a single snap this year. As for Matthew Vanderslice, beautiful name. That's a wonderful name. You were born to play offensive tackle with the last name Vanderslice. That's a really cool name. Besides that, I don't really have too many thoughts on him. I haven't really done too much research on him. I know he was signed with a futures contract, I believe, before the offseason started. So they're giving him a shot. They're seeing what he can do. So we'll see what he's about. But I think he's firmly on the super long shots to make the roster list for sure.
Yeah, either a just born to be offensive tackle or a terrible golfer, Vanderslice.
Yeah.
Kind of a fancy name, though, nonetheless. This whole group is kind of named guys. The interior, you've got undrafted free agent Emil Ekiyor from Alabama. He was probably going to be a mid-round guy, but I believe there was medical concerns about his knees, which dropped him out, and that's why he's an undrafted free agent. And for that reason, he's kind of a popular pick to even threaten Will Fries, perhaps, as starting right guard. If people were going to pick an undrafted guy to threaten a starter or significant role player on the Colts, that's probably where they're starting. At least a lot of people. That's probably the most vulnerable spot. He's also an Indy kid as well. And then Arlington Hambright, he's been around for a couple years. Love the name. That to me sounds like if the Hamburglar went like in the Witness Protection Agency in the Hamptons, that's who we're working with right here.
There you go.
I love the names more than I love the players so far, but I'm waiting for training camp to see what these guys are all about.
I will say about Arlington Hambright, you could do worse for a long shot guy to be on your list or whatever, because he's been around the league for a couple of years. He's made active rosters. He's been at the bottom of rosters before. Like, obviously, this is not a guy who you're expecting to start or expecting to fill in any capacity, but he's a guy who's been around the league for a minute. So I kind of like having that in the long shot category. Like, hey, let's see what you can do. We've seen you for a little bit. The NFL clearly thinks you're good enough to be here. So let's see if you can be good enough to stick on a roster. But Emil Ekiyor, I think this is the guy who really is going to fill up this segment here. It is a really fascinating thing because I scouted him for the Indy Draft Guide. I was on offensive line duties this year. And to me, I think he's kind of a Danny Pinter-like player where I don't want him at guard at all. Like, I just don't. He can play guard better than Danny Pinter can because he has a little bit more strength in his game, but he's also just a smaller guy without super long arms. Like, you could see it on film. He just looks like a center playing guard. It looks like Danny Pinter did last year when he played with the Colts there at right guard. It just doesn't look right. Doesn't feel right. The cohesion's a little off. He gets overpowered at times. I prefer him mostly at center. But again, when we're looking at this roster makeup and we're looking at where an undrafted free agent could fit in, the interior offensive line is so weak behind the starters that you have to at least kind of project Ekiyor to make the roster, right? Like, you have to at least be kind of confident about it, because if they keep two interior backups, Danny Pinter is one, Dakota Shepley, Wesley French, I'm not sure if they're better than Emil Ekiyor, because for all the things I just said that I don't love him at guard, he is an Alabama just tough player, that homegrown kid who's also got plenty of athleticism and some good things on film, really technically sound as well. Like, I feel better about him than maybe those other two guys, but I don't know. It's really interesting. I don't really see him much as a guard, even though I feel better about him than Danny Pinter at guard. But I certainly don't feel better about him at guard than Will Fries, for people thinking that he could usurp him there as the starting right guard. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. I do like Ekiyor. I do think he should have been drafted. Obviously, the injuries come in, and that's why he fell. But he's going to be a really, really interesting player to watch this offseason, see if he can make some noise and get his way on that final roster.
Yeah, like you mentioned, being from Alabama certainly does work in his favor, being an undrafted guy, because you already have a lot of fundamentals ironed out, and just being from a program that kind of prepares you to be a pro. Like, that's how Alabama is. So you don't have to do a ton of work on that to get that out of an undrafted guy like him. So that kind of helps. But
yeah,
shoot, any more thoughts on the offensive line? You worried? You scared? You good? What?
If I had expectations for the Colts this year to be like a playoff team, I'd be pretty scared of this offensive line. I would be thinking, man, they have no depth. The starters have some spots where, I'm concerned about the big three bouncing back from last year. I'm concerned about the two younger guys taking that step forward. And then we don't really have the depth that if any of those things don't pan out, that we can just throw the depth in there. We don't really have that whatsoever. But because this is a year all about learning and going young and just kind of building for the future, I'm not as concerned as what I could be. Because it really is all about what Will Fries can do with a full season, what Bernhard Raimann can do with a full season, and determining if those guys are worthy of being starters and being guys that you're going to invest in going forward. So with that in mind, and with a couple of the other young guys behind them, I'm fine with it. Go young. Let's see what happens. If they maybe bring in like an additional veteran at right guard just to be a backup player to Will Fries, just so there's something there. But outside of that, I'm okay with the young guys. Get them out there, see what happens, and let them grow with their super young quarterback.
Yeah, I wish they would have done a little more, not necessarily like build up this great wall where, you're loaded with free agents or anything, but I would like to see more veteran depth presence back there, more insurance, because, like you said, one of the biggest cautionary tales of getting your young quarterback killed comes from the Colts. Like Andrew Luck, as frequently as the term generational prospect is thrown around, he was a true generational prospect, and Andrew's career is over already, in part due to the porous offensive line put in front of him early in his career. You can look at David Carr as well with the Texans. What would he have been like? So you want to make sure your rookie quarterback isn't like, there's so much you can do you shouldn't create problems for him, basically.
Yeah.
Like, put a decent offensive line in front of him with some insurance. I do like, I'm fine with the starting five they have now, but I just don't feel great if any of those really important guys gets hurt. That's basically where I'm at.
Yeah, and it doesn't really need to be any high dollar signing. Chris Reed a couple seasons ago was a phenomenal signing, like just an outstanding signing that they brought in, and he was a depth guard. And when he got out there, he was really, really good for the team. It's just something like that, bring in someone who's been there, done that, has some starting experience. It doesn't have to be like, I'm not even asking for Andrew Norwell or Trey Turner or any of those guys. Just bring in some capable body behind these two guards, and then I feel fine. I feel okay about it. So that's really my only gripe with it. I'm excited to see these young guys, and I really want to see what Will Fries and Bernhard Raimann can do, and if they can. You mentioned their Pro Football Focus ratings going up throughout the season. I really want to see it go up again this next season. Can Raimann get close to 80 overall? Can Fries push 70 overall? Those are big things for me. I want to see if those guys can just get better, and I'm excited that they're both going to have the opportunity to do so.
Yep. With that, I got nothing else. I'm ready to move on to the defensive line next.
Yep. Coming up, guys, on Locked On Colts the rest of this week. All you beautiful everydayers, make sure you're tuning in every single morning as we're talking defensive end group now tomorrow, which will include questions of whether Kwity Paye or Dio Dengbo is due for a bigger breakout. If you guys don't already, follow at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2 on Twitter. Also, subscribe to Locked On Colts podcast on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We love your guys' ratings and reviews, and we'll see you guys bright and early tomorrow morning.